All right, cool, great. So we'll wait until 4:15, give it another couple minutes, and then we'll start.
You're screaming.
Oh, sorry.
Cereal. I like to eat cereal during meetings.
I've been eating Honey Nut Cheerios like it was the only food on the planet.
Honey Nut Cheerios slap.
I've just been like, a real meal or more Honey Nut Cheerios?
I have this honey cereal right here.
Those are good too. And the one with the strawberries. Those are really good.
Yeah.
This is like my childhood in a box. Like my family had a serious addiction to this cereal. Like all of the things.
All right, cool. So let's get started. Dope. What I will say, just for noise purposes, can we adopt the practice of just keeping muted when other folks are speaking, just so, because the noise can be a lot, and if you have it on a different setting, the minute there's like an iota of noise on another one, it switches. And it also just makes it easier to hear in general. Great, beautiful, thank you. So hello all, here we are, inside, in quarantine, you know. My name is Jackie, if you don't know me already, but I think most folks in here know me. Blue and I both run LANTE. That's Blue right there, waving with their headphones. Blue and I both run LANTE, which is a collective of poets dedicated to mutual aid, political education, and the revolutionary possibility of words. Yeah. We are both artists, we're both poets. We started doing this last year with sort of a different scope. I think our scope has really adapted sort of through a trial and error process of figuring out what we wanted to do and what the folks around us needed. And so we really want to emphasize, like moving into the new year, we wanted to really emphasize like political education as well as like direct aid efforts as much as we could. And obviously with everything that's going on, that's kind of really expedited it, which is unfortunate to an extent, but also like we're just jumping right in, right? So Blue, if you want to say a little bit about LANTE, I would love that. That would be great.
Okay, hey everyone. Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Jackie said, we're pretty much, while Jackie and me like reach out to folks and say, hey, we'd love if you do this. We think you have information, or we think you have poetry, or we think you have resources that the community could use. We are pretty much a collective, so it is kind of just like people all informed. And yeah, I think Jackie perfectly said what needed to be said. Yeah. I'll think of something else if it comes up. But yeah, that's pretty much what we do and who we are. And yeah, circumstances has certainly exacerbated the need for it. So here we are. That's it. That's all I have to say.
If you see in the chat, Nyla also put, I was going to have folks go around and say this anyhow, but if it would be helpful, you can put your pronouns next to your name in your profile, which I'm going to figure out how to do right now because I'm still learning Zoom, but you can if you want to.
You just click when you go to the square at the top where your face is, click on your name, and then a drop down will show up, and you scroll down to rename, and then a little box will come up, and you can just add your pronouns there to the box.
But it won't work if you're on your phone, because I've tried to change my name.
If you're on your phone, there is a rename function. I don't know where it is, but it does exist somewhere.
We have to like leave the chat and go back into our settings to do it.
Bye.
Yeah. All right, I'll be back.
Or me
It's not an issue.
I'm looking at it on my computer and I'm like, oh, here we go. Ha ha ha.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Figured it out. Yeah, you do need to be on the computer.
It makes it way, way easier when you're there.
Sorry, I didn't mean to slow down the meeting.
No, you're totally fine. It's because I was going to have everybody go around and do it anyway, like via video and speech, but it's good for it to just be there to like refer to if need be. Yeah. We have mad time anyway. I don't think we're going to take up the full time, and I wasn't anticipating us taking the full time. Beautiful. There's Emmanuel. Perfect. Cool.
Back.
Yay. Amazing. We have all the names and stuff up here, but let's just all each jump in, go around, introduce ourselves, say a little bit about ourselves, say what our pronouns are. So like I said already, my name is Jackie. I run LANTE. My pronouns are she, her.
I'm Blue. Pronouns are they, them, and I'm the other half of LANTE.
Hey, I'm Nyla. My pronouns are she, her. I'm in this bitch. What up?
Hey, I'm Lanesia. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an artist and I'm a part of a queer trans organization called Squad.
Greetings, y'all. This is Emmanuel. I'm a tenant organizer from the South Bronx Tenants movement. Pronouns he, him, his. Let's talk about these rent strikes.
Great. So I kind of wanted to just jump in with initially some sort of FAQs. More so, there's a lot of, I was saying this to Emmanuel when we were speaking also, there's a lot of like misinformation that's sort of happening in terms of, I don't want to say proper structures, but structures that are going to sort of have results. And there's a lot of misinformation, and not necessarily misinformation so much as it is a lack of information surrounding what's currently going on in terms of like eviction moratoriums, mematoriums, and things like that. So I more so am curious, Emmanuel, to hear what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you've been hearing, and can you like provide a little bit of clarity, maybe clear those up a little bit?
All right. So there's been many things that's happened within the past few weeks, very monumental things that, for whatever reason, people think that because this happened, it also implies these other things, but that's not necessarily the case. So the governor, and it went as far as like the federal government, put in place an eviction moratorium, which started with community organizing groups pushing for such legislation to occur. And for what it's worth, these organizations, they won that big thing, which was the eviction moratorium. So that means that landlords, they cannot evict anyone within a 90-day period. So a total of 3 months. It's huge, it's monumental. It also tells us that yeah, like if tenants wish to organize, if they, for whatever reason, they cannot pay the rent or whatnot, like they can't get evicted. Also, like housing court isn't functioning as it would on any normal given day of the year because of the restrictions on on the workforce, people staying home, etc. So it's important for people to understand that they have the right to shelter in home, and that they can't get evicted within the next 90 days. That's one. Secondly, I would say, as of recent, de Blasio, which is our mayor here in New York, he told the world that he was putting in place a rent freeze. So every year the rent goes up, right? And people hate the fact that the rent goes up. People are like, man, the landlord's like really coming after me. He's just trying to evict me. He's just trying to make life really difficult for me and my family, right? But every time you renew your lease, especially if you're a rent stabilized tenant, which is the majority of tenants living here in New York, um, every time you renew your lease, it goes up by a certain percentage, and that percentage is determined by the mayor through the rent guidelines board. And so when the mayor said that he was going to freeze all rents, he was basically implying that he was not going to raise those rents. So rent was not going to go up according to any sort of lease renewal that you would have to go through within this period, until like next year. So next year we might have to fight for a rent freeze, or we might have to fight so that the city could reduce the rent. Or if it was to increase the rent, we would have to fight it so that it would increase it by a small margin rather than 5% or 7%, which is what they were proposing earlier this year. So the rent freeze is not saying that, yeah, this is a rent-free zone. What it's simply saying is that rent won't go up for the rest of this year. And right now, there are a lot of community organizing groups that have been circulating a petition. They've been organizing around this for quite some time now. Post the eviction moratorium victory, the idea that tenants shouldn't pay rent when government's consistently telling them to stay home, and that they shouldn't go out to work. So it's interesting, just this whole campaign in its totality. But the governor, he said that the eviction moratorium in and of itself is a solution to the whole rent question, but you can't explain why a person like Doña Juana, who's a tenant leader that I'm working with here in the South Bronx, got a rent statement saying that she's owed a certain amount of money for the month of April. So landlords, they still have this business mentality, even in the midst of crisis. A lot of people are calling this disaster capitalism, because that's what it is. It's capitalism functioning even in the midst of crisis, even in the midst of government saying you got to stay home, you got to take care of yourself, your health comes first. But it's obvious that the market and capitalism itself comes first. And so, we're trying to organize tenants to take a stand, to fill out petitions, to circulate these petitions. We got over 80,000 petitions through the Housing Justice for All campaign, and the Right to Counsel. And I know that there's a senator out in Queens who also is trying to put this up for debate and possibly pass legislation around a rent moratorium. But it's a very interesting topic, and I think for an organizer like myself, it provides a lot of questions and answers. It provides opportunity, then impotency. And it also just like really it makes it clear as day on which side the government is on. And it's easy to have conversations with people when things are as clear as day. So it's a politicizing piece in and of itself. And it's really, really sad that it has to be a politicizing piece, because as we're politicizing people, we're also telling people that they have to take a stand, because the government is not going to take that stand for them. And that's the tragic part. So it's telling poor and working class people to stay home, to not work. But it's giving them no other choice but to go out and work, even if that means working in an informal job where they're probably making minimum wage or probably below, just given the circumstances. Just because, like, the question of rent is still lingering in the minds of people. They have to pay rent, and they have to buy food. And honestly, in the month of April, and certainly going to happen in the month of May, like, these are going to be two big points that people are going to have to really decide on, whether they're going to buy food or pay the rent. Because even though tenants can't get evicted right now, that doesn't mean that they won't be accumulating a balance during these 3 months. So let's say it's June and the eviction moratorium has been lifted. Now you're talking about tenants who had to pay $1,000 every month, who now suddenly, because they didn't work, they're owing $3,000 on top of the incoming month's rent. And where are they going to get that money? So I said a lot there, but just want to
No, it's really
hear
helpful.
from you guys.
Thank you for that. A question that I have in particular, so you and someone else shared an article about folks in, I don't remember the city off the top of my head, but it was about folks who were taking over vacant buildings in the wake of everything that was happening, right? And sort of like reclaiming these spaces for folks who needed shelter and for people who needed a place to stay, like in the midst of everything going on. My biggest question, because this is the commentary that you wrote also, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, was you said that there right now is sort of a misconception that this is not an opportune time for folks to be organizing, right? And there's this sort of larger narrative amongst a lot of people that this is not a great time for these like things to be happening. I think specifically my question being, what would you say to folks who are concerned about contracting illness, are concerned about social distancing? What would you say to them in terms of how we organize in keeping the possibilities of like, contracting illness in mind, keeping the most vulnerable in mind, and protecting those folks?
Oh, for sure. And I appreciate this question because I think it's important. It hits home to where folks are at on the ground. And by folks, I'm talking about tenants. I'm talking about homeless people. Yeah, and just like poor and working class folks in general. So the government has been telling people to not go to work. However, there are people who are working because of this question of rent, because of this question of buying food, because of this general question of being able to access resources. Resources are not going to be given to people, they have to buy them, unfortunately. And so you have communities like the South Bronx, which is where I'm from, which is the area I'm organizing, where there is price gouge. So if you go to a local store, and let's say, for example, you want to buy hand sanitizer, it's not going to cost you $5. It's probably going to cost you $10. And like, after speaking to some of the people in the bodegas who are selling hand sanitizer, they're saying that they bought a box of 12 hand sanitizers for a total of $120. So, they're being bamboozled even in this larger web. So there's a lot of money that's like just surrounding this whole entire pandemic, this whole crisis. There's a lot of issues that that's occurring. Again, it's like capitalism has not taken a pause. It's still going. It's still functioning, and it's trying to be normal. But it can't because, at the same time, government is telling people to stay home and people are not going outside. And so that's like the tension that's happening. So like when landlords are charging people rent, and then you have the government who's saying that, yeah, well, I did the best I could, like I already solved the issue of the rent just indirectly by like, preventing evictions. That's capitalism right there. That's all those folks, that class of people defending the interests of the capitalist system. And so, I think poor and working class people, in order to survive, they're putting their economic health above their own general health. Um, it's sad to say, but that's the general situation. And so, like, you have a lot of people who are going outside, even as it is. I understand that there's a general fear about going outside and that people shouldn't be just going out and about. But for a lot of poor and working class people, like, they do have this pandemic in the back of their heads, but they do emphasize their economic health above everything else. So they are going outside. They are going to the stores to buy food, even if that means like being in line just to enter a supermarket. Um, you know, I think it's interesting to just to see how this is all playing out, because for poor and working class people, like they're gonna do whatever they can to not just sustain themselves but to sustain their families. Um, the federal government is not gonna enforce poor and working class people from like working or not working. Like it's just like an informal rule. Like we're telling you what you should do, but you could do whatever you want. That's how it's playing out, in practice. Even though generally speaking, like people are putting their health at risk. Um, but I think for us organizers, yeah, like we should be cognizant of our own health, of the impact we may have with the people around us and the people we're trying to organize. Just because this is a virus that, like, we could pass on. But because capitalism is functioning normal, it's no excuse to stop organizing. And it just means that we have to rethink what organizing means during this moment. For one, I mentioned the capitalist system, and there is an avenue there to organize around. One being like the rent strike. How do we disrupt landlords from making a profit in the middle of this pandemic? How do we also safeguard the rights of tenants, and just the ability for families to stay in their houses, in their homes? This is an eviction moratorium that's meant to last for 90 days. Um, Science experts have stated that this is a virus that we're thinking about. Yeah, this is going to be a year-long thing, possibly next year. A 90-day eviction moratorium isn't enough, and it's clear. So, I think for us, like, we need to really think about, like, how do we re-envision organizing the working class, and also not caretaking for the working class, um, gauging where they're at and how far they're willing to go. Let's not just assume for them. Let's not make decisions for them. Let's ask them where they're at. Um, Yesterday, I had a protest in front of two buildings I organized, and we were outside. We followed all the health protocols. We had masks. We had gloves. Um, Rather than enforcing a 6 feet separation from each person, we did 7 feet, just in case, like, if police came or anything like that. Just because police is like now ticketing and fining people if they're huddled together in groups. But we made a statement. We had press. We were saying that we want Governor Cuomo to cancel rents. And that if he didn't cancel rent, not only are we gonna strike, but sadly enough, yeah, like, just in case, just for us to have some sort of peace of mind, we're gonna continue to work. Some of us are gonna continue to go outside. Some of us are gonna continue to try to make ends meet. You know what I mean? Because when people are thinking about working, they're thinking about whether they could pay the rent and whether they could, like, purchase food for their family. Like, they're going to work with that intent. So, I think in general, and I mentioned this before, I think in general, it's very irresponsible of government to tell people to stay home and not tell people that they didn't have to worry about their rent. Had government told people, listen, don't worry about your rent. We're going to just cancel rent for the time being. But in the meantime, make sure that you're home. Then that would just entirely change the whole dynamic, and people would have stayed home. And who knows, that would have probably had an impact on how many people contracted the virus. But I do want to emphasize that we need to communicate with the poor and working class. We need to communicate with tenants, and we need to see where they're at. Because for some tenants, like they might be willing to organize within the confines of their building, and
Yeah,
that's
that's
good
what I
enough.
was gonna say too, is like I love that you use the phrase I love that you use the phrase like meeting them where they're at, because I think that there is sort of a paternalistic inclination and like a paternalistic way of interacting that I think people have that they don't often take into consideration when coming in contact with, and like, working with other working class people sometimes, especially if you're coming at this from like the perspective of an organizer, like even as a working class person, even if you're in the same, like, let's say like financially you're in the same place, there's sometimes this sort of notion, this, like I said, very paternalistic notion that there's folks who aren't interested, and it's like you have to meet people where they're at too, just because they're not coming at it from the same like framework that you do all the time. Like they're still thinking about these same things, because like you said, at the end of the day, everybody is just interested in making sure that their kids are fed, their family is fed, that they're able to be inside, that they're comfortable to the extent that they can be comfortable. And so it's actually great that you started saying that, because I wanted to segue into that a little bit. This talking about how folks are sometimes more comfortable organizing within the confines of their particular building, or like even a rental company, for example, and things like that. So like, can you speak to that a little bit? What does that sort of look like?
So there's a building that I had some level of communication with, just because I tried organizing them about a year ago. And for whatever reason, the tenants in that building opted to discontinue the tenant association. That's a whole story in and of itself. But before we discontinued the tenant association, and as we were gaining momentum, insofar as like the strategy that we were kind of sketching out, um, we decided to form a WhatsApp group. And so it's interesting because I haven't really heard from these tenants in a while, but in the past few days, they just started using the WhatsApp group. And mind you, this is a building where the landlord, he's essentially absent from the building. There's no super. Tenants are quite literally on their own, unless like, there's someone who owes money. That's when you'll probably see like some sort of intervention from management just entering the building in some way, shape, or form to enforce like the payment of rent, right? But this is a building that's in a very decrepit situation because of everything I mentioned. But the tenants has started using the WhatsApp group, and uh, they were really brainstorming about ways in which they can like look out for each other. They were offering the idea of like, hey, like let's all like collectively like clean the hallways like twice a week, and let's make sure we do like a deep cleaning just so that like all of us are safe and our families are safe. Um, and like, I think there's nothing that replaces building tenant associations, because like that's what comes out of building those kind of structures. You have like these networks that they're able to like just, like almost like kickstart into action whenever there's like a crisis or some sort of problem. And in this situation, yeah, this particular building, the tenants like they banded together. And that's what they're doing. This is their form of mutual aid. And and there's other situations in different places where rather than doing that, like they're being very explicit about just looking out for each other, asking each other what kind of support they need, if tenants are feeling healthy, if they need food and stuff, and things of that sort. So I think now more than ever, it's important to kind of build like the genesis of a tenant association in buildings that don't have a history of building tenant associations. At least in this moment in time, building it out of necessity, out of pure survival. I think it makes perfect sense for poor and working class folks to do that, and organizers as well. Uh, I know that for many organizers, they have a deep concern around like just going outside and going into other buildings. But I think that doesn't mean that you can't coach someone over the phone to do that. That doesn't mean that even if it means that if you want to visit somebody, like just keeping the visit very brief, share information, let them know that they're supported in what they're doing, and that like there's a citywide movement behind them. You know, if it's not around like the mutual aid stuff, it's certainly behind them around like the rent strike stuff. So I think that's the kind of support we need to really stress when speaking to poor and working class folks, especially in this climate. Um, in the buildings that I'm organizing currently, one of the buildings don't have cooking gas, and so how does organizing under this climate look like for them? And what we did was we made our action public. We made our outcry public. We told the world that in this building there is no cooking gas, and that the landlord, what he's trying to do now is he's trying to do construction, and under we're under the understanding that not a lot of people are working. Many industries have closed, and so what kind of workers are you bringing in to do repairs in a building? Are there under the table workers? Are there licensed workers? Those are all questions worth interrogating. So this is a climate where it's very dangerous. Landlords are certainly trying to take advantage of the situation. And it's important for tenants to be vigilant and more so organizers, to not fall into the paranoia of the coronavirus and not wanting to interact with poor working class people, but rather how do we re-envision organizing under this climate?
Yeah, for sure. And so essentially adapting to circumstances while simultaneously using the same structures that have been proven to work, essentially. Yeah. So another
Exactly.
good question. So if somebody says if somebody came up and was like, yo, I really am trying to organize, let's say, my building in particular, and like they're really serious about having that happen and they're really serious about making this work for them and for their neighbors, I would say, what are like 3 action items that would be a good place for them to start and that might help them sort of build what they need to build? And just like what would be 3 action items as a starting point for them to sort of grow what they need to grow, essentially?
No, absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned that because yesterday, in our action, there were tenants who approached me about wanting to organize in spite of everything that's going on. They wanted to do it now, and the advice I gave those tenants was, I think it's important for you to build those links, those necessary links with your neighbors. Um, just build a database of contacts. Like, make sure you get people's names, their numbers. See if people are interested in forming a WhatsApp group, if they have access to WhatsApp. Also, just seeing if people would be interested in forming a tenant association. So interrogating that question, a little bit. amongst the neighbors, while also like just like highlighting the reality of the situation. What's going on right now in the state of housing around the country, around New York State. There are tenants who, um, they don't know if they should pay rent. They probably feel like they shouldn't pay rent, but they're probably being obligated to pay rent by a landlord. Um, like just interrogating that and cross-examining it with the reality of our movements, like what are we doing as a movement to address those questions, what's the government doing. um yeah, like I think it's important to just do that deep diving of political education, of essentially just understanding the landscape right now, to really agitate people. I think for me, that's helped agitate a lot of tenants. And it's helped me like really win them over to the concept of a rent strike, um, which and the two buildings I'm organizing, they decided that they wanted to pursue a rent strike in the case that if the governor was not going to cancel rent. So, you know, I think it's important to start things slow, make sure you have an understanding of your neighbors, like who they are, how they're doing, obviously, what are their needs, um, as well as just seeing whether they're interested in forming a tenant association, whether they want to be plugged into a network of neighbors in the building, whether it's via a WhatsApp group.
Dope. Thank you for that. I was just writing that down. Interested in forming tenants association. Another question that I have, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot that I sort of haven't seen floated. This is something that I really haven't seen been floating around as a concept. I live in a NYCHA building. So for folks whose landlord is the city of New York, right? But right, and it's like the mind-blowing thing. It's like for folks whose landlords are the city of New York, and
That's me right there.
Right, exactly. So it's like
Yeah.
this situation where also, right, sort of this conundrum of like, it's different circumstances, but also the majority of folks who are in NYCHA right now, most folks who are part of like who live in NYCHA buildings are going to be very directly impacted by everything that's happened, right? Whether that be they've been laid off from where they were working, whether that be like, yeah, just like all these given circumstances. What might that look like, as opposed to a building where you have like a landlord who owns a couple of buildings, or whatever. Like when your landlord is the city of New York, what does organizing around that look like?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and it's something that I'm still kind of thinking through as well. Just being like a NYCHA resident myself, um, out here in the South Bronx. But one thing I would say is that in NYCHA buildings, there is like an established tenant association. Okay, what are they doing? Are they a fighting tenant association, or are they a complacent management-based tenant association? You know, are they trying to address the needs of people during this time? Are they trying to work with people? Do they know if anyone in these buildings have the coronavirus? Like, what kind of risk might that pose on people who live in the building? Let alone the complex. I would start there with the tenant associations. And I say that just because that's an official body. That's something that, let's say, in a private building, it doesn't exist. Like, you just can't go to any casual, uh, building where there's a landlord and, there's a bunch of tenants and expect there to just be a tenant association. Sadly enough, that's not the city we live in. That's not That's not how our neighborhoods are like. That's just not how capitalism has, you know, like supported us. That's just not how it's done things. Um, you know, I would say it's important to interrogate what tenant associations are doing in NYCHA buildings. From there, see how management could support tenant associations. If all else fails, I would just, organize assuming the tenant association is absent. It just does not want to service or do any sort of work to support, its neighbors. Um, Same with management. I would just organize, go door knocking one by one, try to build like a floor capping system. How would that look like? Where each floor we have representatives, and their job is to look out for the people in that floor, um, so that we could know like who's healthy, who's not. We could also see who needs a little extra support, who might need like some food, and how we could also push NYCHA to act during this moment of crisis, because and this applies also for private housing, where you have landlords and rent stabilized units and whatnot. But um, we enter this crisis with many pre-existing issues. Uh, Prior to this corona crisis, there was a housing crisis. There's a racial crisis. There was a health crisis. There were so many crises, and now we're in this corona crisis, and that's dominating the media. That's dominating a lot of the thinking, and it's won the hearts and minds of people, and people are so concerned about it. But the way this virus is interacting with the poor and working class, it's certainly discriminating. You know what I mean? And I say that because it's scientifically proven that if you have pre-existing issues like diabetes, like cancer, like asthma, this virus could very well be lethal. And when we're talking about a place like the South Bronx, we're talking about one of the congressional districts with the highest asthma rates.
Right, and like
We're
the
talking
ways that
about
environmental racism and things like that have already kind of weakened have already kind of predisposed and set up the framework for folks to be, like you said, possibly lethally affected by the effects of this virus.
Right, and the only reason that we're in a crisis over this, like a national crisis where people actually give a fuck, is because it's affecting white non-working class people. Like they didn't
right.
hear us.
Exactly. And we could dive into like, just doing like a community, like data mapping of like how many hospitals exist in the Bronx. How many clinics exist, how many mobile clinics exist. Just to like kind of like see like how disproportionately impacted we are. Like people are already they're already speculating. They're saying that like the Bronx is a ticking time bomb so far as like this virus is concerned. So I think about that, and I think about the state of housing. I think about how a lot of people are living with rats, living with mold, living with leaks, and all those are triggers of asthma, and other respiratory issues. That's not necessarily the coronavirus. So you add the coronavirus on top of that, and we're just talking about, an overkill situation. Um, you know, and this is just based on like just an observation of the landscape. Um, it's not a deep dive. It's not, I'm not pulling like a well-researched analysis. Like it's just an overview. You know what I mean? So I think there's a very, very sharp case to be made for, particularly NYCHA buildings, but, like poor working class neighborhoods and neighborhoods like the Bronx, to get more resources. Like, how do we, rather than acting in response to, how do we ensure we're creating preventative measures? And how is government supporting poor and working class people, people of color, in creating these preventative measures? Obviously, they're not looking out for us, but you know, we have to re-envision an alternative scenario. And I say that just because there's a lot of moving pieces. I think this is opening a lot of people's eyes, and I think at some point we're gonna have to really evaluate things and you know, really think about like what it means to not just build economic power but political power among poor working class people, and how would it mean for poor working class people to actually govern? How would we do things differently?
Yeah,
You know,
definitely. For
yep,
sure. No, that
that's
makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah. That sort of covers the questions that I have and the things that I kind of wanted to discuss. I want to open it up to see if folks wanted to add anything, if folks had like more specific questions, things that I was not thinking about or, you know, didn't bring up, stuff like that. We're also going to have we also do have another one of these calls scheduled for what's today? Today is Thursday. We have another one scheduled for tomorrow. I don't know why I'm acting like I don't know that. We have another one scheduled for tomorrow as well. So I kind of wanted to check in and see if there were specific things that folks would like to ask right now, things that I didn't touch on that I couldn't think of. And then also, if you're coming back tomorrow, what are some things that you might want to focus on during that call?
So I just had one specific question. In terms of like the moratorium, what specific buildings does it apply to, or does it apply to all renters? Because I know
That show called Small Doses.
I
I'm
know.
sorry.
Okay. When I looked up who was getting a mortgage freeze for landlords, it only applied to 2 or 3
Small.
small houses slash
Yeah.
buildings. But like, how does that play out for the rent freeze and moratorium?
Yeah. So here's an interesting fact. That's not really like there isn't a lot of information about this, but let's say if a landlord, he might be big, but let's say he got a loan to purchase a particular property, let's say like this huge building or whatever. He got that loan from Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, which is like, you know, the government essentially, right? Then he doesn't have to pay, he or she or they don't have to pay um mortgage payments. So they could very well be charging people rent and, you know, literally making a profit during this time of crisis. Um, what you said is correct. The eviction moratorium what came included into that was a stop of any sort of you know, mortgage payments for smaller landlords. Um, you know, but not some of these bigger landlords, unless like they're getting like you know, loans from like the government to like initially like to purchase their home. You know, so the eviction moratorium implies it's something that applies for everyone. Uh, it was sanctioned not just by local government, but also by the federal government. And it applies for everyone. There isn't no one who could get evicted, whether you're a rent stabilized tenant, whether you're a non-rent stabilized tenant. Yeah, I mean, honestly, like the general standard for an eviction is that you have to take someone to court, and then the court sanctions the eviction. So government is not going to sanction any sort of eviction. So, you know, like usually like when an eviction happens, the marshals come, they change the locks, they tell you to leave. the government is not doing that. So if, you know, if there's like these like very rare examples where the landlord's taking initiative himself to evict the family, not only is that illegal, but you know, he's certainly not respecting the recent decision. And also like, yeah, that's very immoral of them.
Word. And so the moratorium is 90 days and the rent freeze is
So the rent freeze would be for the rest of the year. So every year we fight New York City. The tenant movement fights New York City so that they do a rent freeze or a rent rollback. You know, I'm of the proponent that thinks that we should always get a rent rollback. But in 2015, we got our very first rent freeze, and that's after 40 years of the Rent Guidelines Board existing. The very like mind you, this is something that if you're thinking 40 years back, like we're talking about like Young Lords, Black Panthers, like these were people who were around probably fighting this stuff. You know, this is like at the highest of the highest, like insofar as like the tenant movement, like just the organizations that were doing like a lot of this stuff. And they didn't succeed. But in 2015, we got the very first rent freeze. And in 2016, we got a second rent freeze. Ever since then, rent has been going up. Just, you know, we haven't been winning. But yeah, this year, the mayor, he said, don't worry about it. We're going to do a rent freeze. And there's been a lot of groups on the ground fighting since September of last year to safeguard that rent freeze. And there's a really good organization. It's more of a coalition that you guys could follow if you guys want. It's called the Rent Justice Coalition. And every year there are folks who in that coalition who they're always pushing for either a rent freeze or a rent rollback. The South Bronx Tenants movement, we stand on the side of like always pushing for a rent rollback, just because we think that rent should not increase. It should not even stay frozen. It should just go back. People should just be paying less, especially if they're living in decrepit apartments.
Hey, I don't know if you already talked about this or not. I had to step away for another call, but so yesterday actually I used the website Who Owns What, and I can put I'll put the link for people if I find it on my phone again. But so I found out.
Great website.
That's great. I was doing some snooping on like other spots and like gathering information as I do on the internet. But I found out that my landlord owns 24 buildings. This man has 24 more. Also, my landlord is 26 years old. So like doing dumb bitch shit.
Wow.
Whiteness, watch it work. But so
That's nuts.
There's 24 mortgages. He has 24 buildings. And through my snooping, I found out he was able to procure these 24 mortgages because he spelled his last name differently on each of the mortgage applications. So scammer shit. But anyway, so I'm in like a slightly better position than some folks, being that I'm not beholden to my lease because I'm not actually on it. But I wanted to put that resource out there because when you go on this website, you can literally see, you put in your address, and by searching your address, they find your landlord. Any other properties that your landlord owns will come up. All of the like documents for each of those properties. So like the deed, the mortgage, anytime a complaint about the actual property has come up, or like anytime someone has like called and they're like, oh, like the pipes don't work, the electricity is not up to code, whatever, that'll all come up. And like if the Department of Housing like opened a case about it, that'll come up. So my building has like a bunch of violations, and then he has another building that has like 526 complaints. So like, you know, we use this as leverage all the time in my building, but so like I wanted to like get more information about how other people can use this information as leverage, because they'll have a lot of people who, like, despite whatever the government is saying, they will try to still put people out. And I think it's a good idea if people can be like, okay, legally you can't put me out anyway, but also I have all this dirt on you, so you really can't put me out, type of thing.
Right. And you know something, landlords get really mad when you just know all of these facts, all these random facts that like he definitely knows, but he's like, wait, how do you know? You know what I mean? So yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned who owns what. I know a lot of those folks over there, and they're doing a phenomenal job. Um, you
Nice.
know, the program director over there, her name is Annalisa, and she's done a lot of great work with that software, and just in making it accessible to organizers and to tenants as well. And you know, I think um, it's an incredible piece of resource for us, because um, through that we get to not just see like the number of violations that tenants reported on 311, but we also get to see like the mortgage documents, like you mentioned. But we also get to see like if the landlord owes any taxes for the property, you know, and that's like an interesting uh, piece of the whole equation in and of itself, because you know we don't really talk about that as much, you know, because that's like the landlord in the city, but you know, it definitely has an impact on tenants and on how the landlord may treat tenants, and how he might be just more forceful about like how he wants to get rents, how he's trying to like kind of like scam the system to get more rent from tenants and stuff like that. But yeah, it's certainly a website worth looking into, and um, getting more information from, especially if you are trying to get information of like landlords and things like that. I personally use it quite literally. Like when I ran into the first building I ended up organizing for the South Bronx Tenants movement, I was using the Who Owns What um, website, um, just to see like whether like 386 was like a good building worth organizing. You know, that ended up being the first building I organized for South Bronx Tenants movement, and it was through like the Who Owns What website. Um, at the time, they had a lot of violations, and that to me was an indicator I should be organizing this building. A lot of violations, very little units. It just made sense. Um, but yeah, it's an incredible resource. One thing that really makes it good is the fact that it links you to the actual primary sources of just government information that the landlord he's obligated to disclose. Obviously, you don't have to use the website to have access to these resources, but the website Who Owns What makes it a lot easier for people to just like know what the landlord's mortgage situation is like, if he got refinanced, if he owes money to the city, how many violations are in the property, etc.
You can also see like when or if your building is paid off. So like there's a couple of people who are living in buildings that are already paid off. So if your landlord is trying to collect rent, especially at this time, even with this moratorium on their mortgage, like you can be like, bro, like your mortgage is paid off, so like relax on me. You know, like if you're living in a building that is paid for, obviously, you know, you're gonna have some leverage there as well. I also wanted to ask you, like, what about people who are like very, very like teeny tiny landlords? Like maybe they have like a basement that they rent out for the tenants living there, who are like probably in like a different situation than someone dealing with a management company or a landlord like mine that owns dozens of buildings. What are their rights if you're just like renting the basement or renting like the top floor of, you know, a multifamily home or something like that? And maybe this person, this is the only piece of property they own. Like, what are their tenants' rights there?
Well, I would say I'm probably the worst person to ask this to, because I just stand in a position where I homogenize landlords. I think if you're making money and you're not working for it, then, what makes you different from a big landlord? You know what I mean? Obviously, you're probably getting less money, and a lot of that money is probably going to doing repairs in the property. But I'm sure there's like some money that's just going straight into your pocket. I know there's some money that eventually, if not now, would eventually get into your pocket. But those tenants who live in let's say like homes, like where like you described, like if there's a landlord, he owns this home and like he's like renting out like the top floor or like the basement or whatever. Those tenants are they're the most vulnerable because those are not rent stabilized tenants. Um, in any given time of the year, like let's take the crisis out of the equation. Let's take the eviction moratorium out of the equation. Just everything. Those are not rent stabilized tenants. That's one. Secondly, what that means is that they're not guaranteed a lease renewal, which really sucks. If you're really trying to like build a family in that neighborhood, you have like, let's say you have a daughter, she's going to the school right across the street, you got a job nearby, and you're living with that constant insecurity. So that's that. And then secondly, like the landlord could literally say, you know what, I'm going to increase your rent 20%. Or I'm going to decrease your rent 20%. Like it's literally up to the discretion of the landlord. But that's because the tenant is not rent stabilized. Because those kind of situations, the apartments are not rent stabilized. So yeah, like I think there is some credibility as to any sort of like effort to humanize like those kind of landlords, who might be small, who might not be like the Park Cashes or like the David Davids or like the Moshi Pillars, which are really, really big, notorious slumlords. But, at the same time, like, if you have a very particular analysis around rent and how rent is theft, and if you think that housing is a human right, then, it just makes sense that you just homogenize all these landlords and you just say, hey, like,
Yeah, I just wanted to know if their like
yeah.
tenant experience would be any different than someone dealing with a larger landlord.
If the tenant,
Yeah, or if they're like a tenant process would it be the same as dealing with a larger landlord as far as like the steps that they would take, or would they take different steps depending on like whether they live in rent stabilized versus unstabilized, whether they live in like a building with a management company versus like a building owned by, a grandma, it doesn't matter. Like a landlord is a landlord, but I'm just wondering like if they have different steps or is it all the same steps that they would take to protect themselves?
the landlord to protect the tenant.
The
Are
tenant
you referring?
to protect themselves.
Oh, the tenant to protect themselves in the middle of this. I mean, honestly, like, if you're rent stabilized, that implies rights that you would have. If you're a tenant who lives in a non-rent stabilized unit, then that would mean that you have very little rights. Obviously, that means that if the landlord wants to evict you, he would have to ultimately like do a proceeding in court, in housing court. Let's say if you want to fight him, it would ultimately go through housing court. Um, so, generally what I would say is that tenants who are living in those kind of situations, they're a lot more vulnerable than tenants living in multi-family units that are rent stabilized units, obviously. I'm not sure if, like, I was having difficulty understanding the question. I'm sorry, but
I would say, and like also my like what, if anything, what type of recourse might they have? And then because what I'm sort of hearing from what you're saying is like there really isn't a lot, unfortunately, just in terms of like legality. What are ways that the community can support them in those situations then? since obviously like if there is no legal recourse, which is kind of what I'm gathering from what your answer is, what are ways then that the people around them and like folks who have the capacity to do so can support them and like further protect them?
Okay. So what I would certainly pivot towards is this idea of like a block association. That's what I think about when I hear that, like, because um, you know, if these are small units, like you're probably like, let's just assume that the landlord lives in the same building as you, right? Like yeah, like I think that would be like your first point of like, yeah, like we should look out for each other. Like that would be like the first point of solidarity. Um, but then like yeah, like how do we really examine the neighborhood, and then from there, like you know like how do we talk about like the issues of the neighborhood? How do we talk about looking out for each other here in the neighborhood? Because when we're talking about issues like price gouge, like that's affecting everyone in the neighborhood. Obviously, like the whole rent thing certainly goes against the interests of the landlord. But it might be more in line with the interests of another tenant living in, let's say, another house or another building in the neighborhood. So how could those kind of tenants like how could they find out whether there's a tenant association that's doing organizing work in the building, and how they could perhaps extend that organizing work into just those homes, like into like the apartment of that tenant, you know to kind of like, again, like informally, like how do we create like the networks needed for like a block association?
The
We're
idea of
not
a
in,
block association being like, so this is kind of how I'm envisioning it. Like if you take a building that's up, right, and just kind of like making it sideways, and this idea
yeah,
of like
yeah,
the couple of, so it's like if the building is coming up this way, you flip it, divide it amongst the block. It's like the same concept of strengthening amongst
right.
who the tenants are versus, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
It's a really good analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Are there any more questions? I think we keep losing Blue because Blue's internet is being they texted me and they were like, my internet keeps going out.
Where did they keep going?
What happened?
I was like, where do they keep going?
They just like disappearing. That's it. No, but they because they texted me, they're like, my internet is coming in and out. Um, yeah. So I feel really good about this. Thank you, Emmanuel, for all your
Anytime.
info. Before we like officially finish, are there any last minute questions, any last minute comments, things like that?
Oh, I had a question. So like am I on? Yeah. So my roommates, like they are from other places. They're not from New York, so they like went home to like wait out the pandemic. Um, as far as them returning, what are their rights as far as, because we don't know how long this is going to last. So let's say in August, things are a little safer and they decide that they want to return here, presumably having not paid the rent. What are things they should anticipate? Because like I'm physically like I said, I'm not on the lease, so like my only real claim to like this apartment is like my physical being being in the apartment, which is why I'm not going anywhere. But um, what are their kind of rights and things they should expect?
Well, I think that all depends on whether the apartment is rent stabilized. I think if they're on the lease, they have a right to the apartment. Um, I'm not sure if the landlord is charging rent. I think the case could be made to, you know, to not charge rent during this time period, and that's the case that we're generally trying to make right now. But if your roommate comes back, they can make that case that, listen, well, we were on rent strike. and we're not gonna pay any sort of balance that you're claiming we owe. Um, and I think in general, like, if the landlord doesn't know that your roommate isn't there, then I think he doesn't have to know that your roommate left.
Right.
So if your roommate comes back, it's fine. And um, they still have a lease that's binding them to that apartment.
Okay.
And that's for you. Like, I think, let's assume you're paying, let's say, the Con Ed bill or a cable bill. Like, that's a case for you to have a claim for the apartment, even though you're not on the lease. So that's a battle that if the landlord chooses to, he could take to court, but he's certainly going to lose.
Oh my God. What if
Um,
I don't have any of those things? Like, I'm literally like, I'm like a squatter that pays. like, like, I was like, yeah, I ain't got none of that shit, actually. like,
oh god.
I didn't pay rent. Like, I could not pay rent yesterday, and I didn't. And like, I'm not
You
working.
shouldn't. You
I'm not
shouldn't.
going to. I don't have any money.
Join the nationwide movement.
Nyla had me screaming the other day because Nyla was like, if the landlord thinks I'm about to pay this rent on April 1st, they're about to be the biggest April Fool. And I was like, honestly, I was like, truly.
Facts.
I don't have it. Like, it is what it is. Like, and then once I found out this dude owned 24 buildings, I was like, nobody told you to do that. Like, I'm so sorry. I was like, that was unwise of you to do.
Oh man.
I remembered he was like 26. I was like, that was a very 26-year-old decision that you made. So,
Oh my gosh.
I can't, like, literally, I could not wrap my head around it. And my roommates were like, how do you just own that much property? And I was like, I don't know.
That's like a baby Trump kind of guy. You know what I mean? Like it's like mommy and poppy money.
like, no,
Literally. Like,
he's like,
because
well,
like ain't no 26-year-old gonna just have that kind of money.
I mean, one thing that works to our advantage sometimes is that, like, if like your rent's gonna be late or something, he's like really cool about it because he's fucking rich. He's like, yeah, just like whatever. Like, he's like, just get it to me by the end of the month or whatever. He's like really cool about it because he's literally rolling in cash.
Where,
He hasn't like hit me up or anything.
oh my gosh.
He probably hasn't like noticed yet, but I'm
Wait,
sure.
That's
Yeah.
wild, right? That someone's in a position not to notice.
Right.
I mean,
It's crazy. He probably
do
like
you
that I haven't paid rent yet, but yeah.
do you live in a building? Is it like a building or like a home?
There's two units in my building. It's a really old.
Oh,
My building was built in 1923. So, but there's two units in my building. But he owns another building that has like 3 or 4 units. But he owns like a larger building that has like 15 in it. He owns across 24 buildings. He has 63 units. So all of the buildings are like smaller, older buildings in Brooklyn. They're all pretty close to where I live. And he has like some ones that are like, I have some friends that actually have the same landlord as me, and I didn't know. But he has some ones that are like clearly for like lower income Black folks, and then he has some like newer, really high renovated buildings that are clearly for like higher income white people. So,
gotcha. So that to me seems like a non-rent stabilized building.
yeah.
Just because it's like less than 8 units. If there's just 2 units in your building, then it's certainly non-rent stabilized. So yeah, it might be a little tricky, but I think there's a strong argument to be made about like the rents and stuff like that. Like, yeah, the landlord doesn't notice that your roommate is not there, and then they come back. Like that's like, you could just lie to the landlord, say, yeah, like my roommate is not home now or whatever. Like, it's like if they still have like a connection to that lease, then that's what stands. That's what's the most important.
Okay. And like our building has a ton of violations. Like we don't have a handrail on the stairway. Um,
Oh gosh.
we don't pay for electricity because the electricity is not up to code. Um, so I have on a bunch of free lights right now. Um, there's like a whole bunch. There's like a hole in our wall. I definitely had to like catch a mouse yesterday because of the hole. So there's like a bunch of shit like happening, and like anytime like the property manager like says anything to us, I'm like, yeah, it'd be like crazy if I call the city about that handrail, huh? And then he just goes away. So,
It's like the housing crisis still exists, even though we're in pandemic mode.
right,
You know what I mean? Like you still got all these housing issues, but
right,
pandemic mode.
right.
It's crazy. Um, like I think I would love to hear a question around like just like how like there are all these pre-existing like crises that are still impacting the life and reality of poor and working class people today. And so like just like really I'm sorry, I just got an incoming call, but also how do we like think about like health and housing and this pandemic. This is a you know this is a crisis. This is a crisis that's impacting people's health. And we're just thinking about this from that standpoint. But um, how does like the economic situation, how does housing like intersect with like all of these things? You know, um, because like housing is just such a fundamental like point of like people's lives. Like that's where they sleep. That's where they oftentimes spend like their leisure time. For some people, that's where they work. Um, that's where children are raised. And so like, what are the health impacts of housing and now more so with this pandemic? Like housing
I
is just this epicenter. I'm sorry, but it's just like this epicenter, and I overemphasize it because that's my view of it.
Yeah, no, for real. I actually think that that's a good. It's actually interesting that you say that because I think that that's a good scope for the call tomorrow. So I think that this is a good I think this is a good place to stop just because like I said I'm going to upload this so that folks can like refer back if they would like to. But I think like given the things that we discussed today, it's a good place to start tomorrow to kind of explore greater like that I wrote down in my notebook. I literally wrote down like I'm thinking about the intersection of housing and health, and like you said, how health impacts housing and vice versa. So I think actually that's a really great place to begin for tomorrow. Any last minute thoughts from anybody at all? Maybe. Dope. Thank you for tuning in, guys. This was really helpful, Emmanuel. Thank you for being with us and thank you for sharing your info. Thank you for everyone participating. I am going to upload this to YouTube and then I'll create the call for tomorrow's call, which is going to be, so we started at 4 today. Tomorrow it's going to start at 7 o'clock. But I will upload the call for that and then we'll put all the information on our page. If you're not already following us, we're pretty active on we're more active on Instagram. So the hashtag, or not the hashtag, geez, the username. So I was like, what the hell is that called? Username for that, I'm gonna put in the chat really fast, but it's at @balante_NYC. We have a lot of interaction. We mostly post like info on our Instagram and things like that. I'm doing a little bit more to post it to like Facebook and stuff like that, so folks can access it if they want to. But if you would like to tune in tomorrow, I'm going to publish all the info for the Zoom probably within so you don't lose the info in here. Oh, you know what? You right. I'm about to do that right now. Let me take a pic of my screen. Okay, Beautiful. Great. Cool. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, thank you, Manuel, for your help and for your info and your graciousness and openness and all that good stuff. Come back tomorrow. We're having another call. We're having a call tonight with Afrofuturist abolitionists of the Americas, and that's going to be really dope. And that's starting at 7, so it's like another hour and a half or so. Yeah. Bye, folks. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Oh, great. Thank you, Emmanuel. And I was like, peace.
All right. All right. Peace.
Bye.